New York bathed in the golden hues of sunset, the towering skyscrapers reflecting the fiery shades of amber and crimson. Elliot Grant sat behind the wheel of his sleek, black Aston Martin, his stormy, gray-blue eyes fixed on the road ahead. After 2 years of exile in Europe, he was finally back. But was this still home? When everything he had once built had crumbled. 2 years ago, Elliot Grant was a celebrated architect, the proud owner of Grant & Co., one of the most prestigious design firms in the country. He had it all: a thriving career, a stunning wife, and a solid place among New York's elite. Until the day he walked in on Madeline, his wife, in the arms of Adrian Cole, his best friend and business partner. That betrayal had shattered more than just his marriage. It had cost him projects, partnerships, and the respect of an industry that thrived on reputation. Leaving had been the only way to escape the whispers, the pitying looks, the humiliation. But now he was back, and this time he wasn't running. The gates of his luxury penthouse complex slid open as his car rolled into the private garage. Elliot stepped out, gripping his keys tighter than necessary. But the moment he walked through the door, something felt off. A scent lingered in the air, subtle, familiar, a blend of jasmine and vanilla. Everything looked immaculate, just as he expected, but something had changed. Then he saw it. His bedroom door, slightly ajar, a faint golden glow spilling into the hallway. His pulse quickened as he strode toward it, his instincts on high alert. He pushed the door open and froze. Celeste Hayes was fast asleep in his bed. Elliot stood frozen at the threshold, his breath caught in his chest. Celeste Hayes, his assistant of 5 years, the one person who had remained steadfastly by his side, was sleeping in his bed. Her long, silky hair fanned out across his pillows, her features softened by deep slumber. She was still in her black fitted dress, the epitome of professional elegance. Yet here, in his private space, she seemed different. Not just efficient, not just competent, but a woman. His grip on the doorframe tightened. His voice, rougher than usual, shattered the silence. Celeste stirred, her honey-colored eyes blinking open. The moment she registered his presence, she bolted upright, hands smoothing down her dress in a futile attempt at composure. "Mr. Grant." Her voice wavered slightly. I didn't expect you back so soon." Elliot crossed his arms, his gaze piercing. "Clearly." He tilted his head, his voice dangerously calm. "Care to explain why you're in my bed?" Celeste inhaled sharply, gathering her dignity like armor. "There was an issue with my apartment building, a burst pipe. The repairs have been delayed and I couldn't find a suitable place on such short notice." She lifted her chin, determination flickering in her eyes despite the blush coloring her cheeks. "This penthouse has been empty for 2 years. I made a judgment call." Elliot studied her, his mind caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Celeste had never overstepped boundaries, never asked for anything. She had kept his company afloat while he drowned in self-imposed exile, shielded his reputation when his life crumbled. And now she was here, in his space. "How long?" His voice was low, controlled. Celeste met his gaze head-on. 3 weeks. A heavy silence settled between them, charged with something neither dared name. Finally, Elliot exhaled. "Move to the guest room." His tone left no room for debate. "You can stay until you find a new place." Celeste hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Grant." She gathered her belongings with swift efficiency, but as she passed him, her arm brushed against his. A jolt of electricity shot through Elliot's spine. At the door, she paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "Welcome home, Mr. Grant." He watched her disappear down the hallway, his fingers curling into a fist. For the first time in 2 years, the emptiness that had haunted him was gone. But in its place, something far more dangerous had taken root. Elliot remained in his bedroom long after Celeste had left. Her scent lingered, jasmine and vanilla, a whisper of her presence that refused to fade. He shrugged off his jacket, loosened the top buttons of his shirt, and made his way to the bar. A glass of Macallan 18 shimmered under the warm lighting, but no amount of whiskey could erase the image of Celeste sleeping in his bed. He couldn't afford to think about her that way. Celeste wasn't Madeline. She wasn't the kind of woman who schemed for personal gain, and she certainly wasn't someone who would betray him. But that didn't mean he could allow himself to be drawn in by temptation. The sharp chime of his phone cut through his thoughts. Elliot glanced at the screen. Richard Vaughn, a senior board member and one of the few people he still trusted. Grant. Hate to interrupt your homecoming, but we have a problem. Richard's voice was heavy with tension. Madeline and Adrian are making a move on the Landmark project. Elliot's grip on his glass tightened. Landmark was the crown jewel of Grant & Co.'s revolutionary architectural project, poised to redefine urban design. And now, Madeline, the woman who had already torn his life apart, was trying to take it from him? How? Elliot's voice dropped to a lethal calm. They're exploiting a clause in your divorce settlement regarding shared intellectual property rights, Richard exhaled. They're claiming the Landmark concept originated from a conversation before your separation. Elliot shut his eyes, anger burning slow and deep in his chest. 2 years ago, they had beaten him once. They had stolen his dignity, his friends, and nearly his career. But this time, he wouldn't let it happen. He set his drink down with deliberate force and strode out of the room. He needed to find Celeste. When he entered her office, she was already seated at her desk, eyes focused on the screen, stacks of neatly organized documents by her side. She looked up the moment he walked in, immediately reading the tension in his face. What happened? Elliot tossed his phone onto her desk, the screen still displaying Richard's email. Madeline and Adrian are trying to steal Landmark. Celeste scanned the screen, then turned back to him. No unnecessary questions, no hesitation. Just a single, resolute nod. We won't let them. Celeste worked through the night. The glow of her laptop screen cast soft shadows over her sharp features as her fingers flew across the keyboard. Elliot sat across from her, watching in silence. She was always like this, focused, relentless, unwilling to back down from a challenge. Got it. Celeste's voice carried a note of triumph as she turned the screen toward him. I found proof that Landmark belongs solely to Grant & Co. This is the original concept draft, emailed by you 2 months before your divorce proceedings even started. Elliot studied the screen, then looked at her. A wave of something unspoken surged through him. You're always 3 steps ahead, aren't you? Celeste shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. That's why you hired me. And in that moment, something shifted. Elliot realized he had been looking at her too long, too intensely, not as his assistant, but as a woman. A woman who had fought beside him for years. He stood, moving toward her. Celeste's breath hitched as she looked up, sensing the change in the air. Grant, she started to step back, but he reached out, gently tilting her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. Tell me you don't feel this. His voice was low, dangerous. Celeste swallowed hard, emotions flickering in her amber eyes. She couldn't. Elliot leaned in, their breaths mingling, tension crackling like a live wire between them. Her pulse thundered, every rational thought screaming at her to stop. But when his fingers traced the curve of her jaw, something inside her shattered. The walls she had spent years building crumbled, leaving only raw, unfiltered longing. And then, she gave in. She kissed him. The kiss ignited like a spark in a storm, but it lasted only a moment before Celeste pulled away, her breath unsteady, eyes wide with realization. We can't. She shook her head, as if trying to push away the emotions surging between them. Elliot didn't speak, but his gaze darkened, studying her as if weighing a decision even he wasn't sure of. Celeste turned away, pressing a trembling hand to her chest. The taste of Elliot lingered on her lips, a reminder of a line they had just crossed. A mistake. Or was it? Before she could untangle the mess of emotions in her mind, Elliot's phone buzzed sharply, dragging them both back to reality. The name on the screen flashed. Richard Vaughn. Elliot's expression hardened, his posture shifting from vulnerable to lethal in an instant. You're being watched. Richard's tone was grim. The press has photos of you and Celeste. Celeste froze. How the hell did they find out? Elliot's jaw clenched. "Madeline," Richard exhaled. "I'd bet anything she had someone tailing you the moment she learned you were back." Celeste felt a chill run down her spine. A media storm was brewing, and this time she was at the center of it. The next morning, tension gripped the headquarters of Grant & Co. The news had spread like wildfire. From assistant to mistress, how Celeste Hayes seduced her boss. Like father, like son? Is Elliot Grant repeating his family's scandal? Celeste stood in her office, gripping a newspaper tightly. She wasn't afraid of facing Madeline. What terrified her was what this could do to Elliot's reputation and to the career she had spent years building. When Elliot walked in, she immediately handed him a white envelope. "I'm resigning," her voice was steady. Elliot glanced at the envelope, then tore it in half without hesitation. "Not a chance." His voice was sharp as steel. "You really think I'd let them force you out?" Celeste's hands curled into fists. "They need someone to blame. If it's me, you get to keep your position as CEO." Elliot let out a dry laugh, though his eyes burned with unshakable resolve. "We don't play by their rules. If they want a war, they'll get one." He straightened his jacket, his expression turning lethal. "The board meeting starts in an hour. Let me tell them and the entire world exactly who Celeste Hayes is." The Grant & Co. boardroom was thick with silence as Elliot walked in, Celeste following closely behind. Every eye in the room turned toward them, some curious, some judgmental, and some waiting for an excuse. At the head of the table sat Howard Grant, Elliot's father. His presence was a message. He had lost everything to a scandal like this once. Was Elliot about to repeat history? Richard Vaughn spoke first. "Elliot, I assume you've seen the news this morning. This could severely impact the company's reputation." Elliot let out a dry chuckle. "The company's reputation?" He nodded toward the massive screen, where Celeste was pulling up a presentation. "Then let's talk about what really defines Grant & Co. Facts and numbers." Charts and graphs appeared, showing the company's explosive growth over the last 5 years. And at the center of every key success, Celeste Hayes. Elliot turned back to the board. "Celeste isn't just my assistant." Elliot's voice rang through the boardroom, steady and unyielding. "She's the backbone of this company. When I fell, she held everything together. When others turned their backs, she fought for what we built." He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the room. "If anyone here doubts her worth, then you're questioning every success Grant & Co. has had in the past 5 years. His hand settled firmly on Celeste's shoulder, his next words leaving no room for argument. "Effective immediately, I'm appointing her as Chief Strategy Officer." The room fell into stunned silence. Howard Grant studied his son for a long moment before giving a slow, approving nod. "If you're willing to stand by her against the entire world, then maybe you've learned the lesson I never did." An hour later, as they stepped out of the boardroom, Elliot's expression was unwavering. Celeste turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You just changed everything." Elliot smiled. "No, Celeste, you did." 6 months later, at the Grant & Co. Gala, Celeste stood in the center of the grand ballroom, radiant in an emerald silk gown. She was no longer just an assistant. She was the Chief Strategy Officer, the woman who had reshaped the company and proved she was more than just a name in an old scandal. Elliot watched her from across the room, not with worry, but with pride. Howard Grant swirled his whiskey, his eyes thoughtful. "She's a formidable woman." Elliot smirked. "She's everything." Under the watchful eyes of hundreds of guests, Elliot stepped onto the stage, his fingers wrapped around a small velvet box. A murmur rippled through the crowd as he turned to Celeste, his gaze unwavering. "Celeste Hayes, you've been running my world from behind the scenes for years. Today I want you to do it as my official partner, in business and in life." He opened the box, revealing a brilliant diamond ring. "Marry me?" The room erupted into applause. Celeste laughed, eyes shimmering. "Yes, Elliot, always you." After everything, they had not only proven that love could exist alongside power and ambition, They had shown the world that sometimes risking everything was the greatest reward of all. 3 months after the proposal, Elliot and Celeste became husband and wife. There was no extravagant wedding, no hundreds of elite guests. They chose a small, intimate ceremony, just family, close friends, and the colleagues who had stood by them through everything. Celeste wore a simple yet elegant wedding dress, her hair in a soft, effortless bun. Elliot held her hand tightly as they exchanged vows, his gaze filled with unwavering devotion. There was no need for grandeur, no need for spectacle, only the quiet certainty that they had found their forever in each other. Their honeymoon was not about luxury, it was about moments. In Paris, Elliot traced lazy patterns on Celeste's palm as they shared coffee at a tiny cafe, the scent of fresh pastries mingling with the morning air. In Venice, she leaned against his shoulder on a gondola, listening to the soft lapping of water against stone. In Santorini, they watched the sun sink into the Aegean, fingers entwined, breathing in the quiet magic of the moment. But it was in Florence, under the soft glow of streetlights, that Elliot pulled her into an impromptu waltz, his low murmur in her ear sending shivers down her spine. "I'd marry you 1,000 times over," he whispered. And Celeste knew this was forever. These weren't just memories, they were proof of the love they had fought for. 3 years passed. In the cozy living room of their home, Elliot and Celeste sat together, sipping afternoon tea, watching their 2 little princesses giggle and play on the plush rug near the fireplace. Celeste watched their daughters, laughter bubbling from their tiny frames as they built towers out of wooden blocks. She leaned into Elliot, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. "Did you ever think this would be our life?" she whispered. Elliot glanced at her, his gaze filled with something deep and unshakable. "I hoped," he admitted, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "But having it? It's more than I ever dreamed." Their hands found each other, fingers interlacing naturally. Outside, the world continued its relentless pace, but here, in this moment, they had everything they'd ever fought for. And it was perfect. And they sat there, surrounded by everything that truly mattered. A family, a love that had withstood every storm, and a future bright with endless possibilities. Happiness, in the end, wasn't a destination. It was a journey they had chosen to walk together.